What are the factors that would deliver victory at the Third Battle of the Matanikau? We look at command and control, situational awareness, and combined arms.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Principles of War. This episode, number 144, is the 10th episode in our Guadalcanal series. We are joined once again by battlefield historian Dave Holland. He's the author of Guadalcanal's Longest Fight, the Pivotal Battles of the Matanikau Front. And today he's taking us through the second part of the Third Battle of the Matanikau River. The Marines have crossed the river inland from the mouth of the Matanikau. They're on high ground, looking down some ridge lines that overlook Point Cruz. And so we'll get right back into the story with Dave. It's raining very heavily. It made manoeuvre very difficult. Obviously, it cut visibility down significantly and it made it miserable, made command and control very difficult. You've got the Marines spread out effectively across three ridge lines. When do they start to push out and how do they affect that?
Yeah, so they dug in for the night to wait the rain out, all on one hill, Hill 66. That's a big ridge line. As soon as you go across, you go up this big hill. So they consolidated there. So 3-2 was the next morning. They were going to peel down the first ridge. The 1-7 was going to peel down the second ridge. 2-7 was going to peel down the second ridge on the Hanneken. Then Puller's 1-7 was going to basically cover the left flank of Hanneken and protect that left flank and then back up Hanneken if need be. And that's what happened. So Hanneken, they moved through and they got hit with some heavy machine gun fire because at this stage, what Thomas had feared had eventuated. The Japanese had basically pulled out, or they were pulling out. And what Japanese had at the mouth of Matanikau, at that stage, the Marines had wiped out over 3 companies of Japanese, but all basically destroyed a battalion of the 4th Infantry Regiment. But the Japanese had been pulling back. And they were very confused. And in one stage, the Japanese were issuing orders to attack. But the Marines, what they were doing, Marines were seeing Japanese retreating to the west over the ridges. But they set out delaying teams of machine guns at certain points. And one of these delaying teams called out basically killed a whole squad of 2-7. And they were holding the battalion back, basically. So Puller was sent to the left with a company. He sent a company to the left to wipe these guys out. And he's up on the hill 80 and 81. So he's involved in a fight too. But 3-2 at that stage had moved over and they went to the mouth of Matanikau and they said, this is clear. The Japanese had pulled out. And then 2-7 then continued on and went over and hit the coast and said, this is clear.
What was the next action?
Yeah, so what happened then was, like I said, Puller had sent his guys up on the ridge after it had wiped out a Japanese machine gun nest. And he was up on the ridge, Hill 80 and 81. It overlooks this ravine, about a 200-foot down into the ravine. And the ravine had really started to come to importance when we talk about the November battles and January battles. Remember I said the Japanese had a unit marching and counter-marching back? So there was the 2nd Battalion of the 4th Regiment. Now, the 2nd Battalion of the 4th Regiment, the reason they were in reserve is because they were depleted. These are the same guys that fought at Edson's Ridge, and they got handled a bit on the 2nd Matanikau. And I've got the unit reports. They landed with 740 guys. They lost half of the men at Edson's Ridge. So they're down to like 360 guys, somewhere around there. Don't quote my Alabama math, but yeah, somewhere around there. And that's why they were put as reserves. Now, you got to remember, so that's roughly 350 guys, this battalion. So they're moving them back and forth. And then Puller's scout looks down. Remember, the Japanese, they used to move in the ravines because it's nice and covered, and they can move back and forth without American air seeing them because they get up on those ridges, all kunai grass open, air power would eat them up. So they used to move in those covered ravines. So Puller's scouts looked down. They could see this Japanese unit moving down this trail. They said, oh, we got them. So they set their machine guns up, their light machine guns and their mortars, and they started pounding them. And then they started calling some 75-millimeter artillery on them. And then they worked them over for a good hour. So it involved in a pretty heavy firefight. Now, at this stage, Vandegrift had issued orders. In fact, he actually came up personally and issued orders that everyone start to pull back because we now know that this large Japanese convoy is heading our way. So we're going to pull everyone back to the perimeter. So they tell Puller, so don't get involved in any large-scale engagements. Do reconnaissance to cook them bonnet, then pull back. So Puller tells his regimental commander, he goes, I'm already involved in an engagement. He goes, what you can't be? He goes, you come up here and see. So, it went back and forth. They told Puller to pull back after he did, and he did pull back. He pulled back, and the rest of the battalions pulled back and retrograded back. But Puller, there's one of the misconceptions of Guadalcanal. They call it Puller's Ravine. I remember years ago, I always told, they killed 600 Japanese in that ravine. And then I used to believe it until I started writing a book and speaking to my friend John Hoffman and a few others, and even Richard Frank says this. There wasn't that many Japanese killed in that ravine. Now, if you look at the reports, there were estimated 700 Japanese killed. Puller's reports basically said initially the Japanese lost 5 times more than he lost. He lost 5. I got another report from a captain. He said there was roughly about 300 Japanese down in the ravine. I got a sergeant's report said there was about 250, 300 Japanese down in the ravine. The Japanese unit reports basically said it couldn't be no more than 350 guys anyway. I think the reason why it's placed at 600 because they captured a Japanese staff officer, the 4th Infantry Regiment's diary, and he says they lost 700 men. And that staff officer was in 2nd Battalion of the 4th. At that stage, he'd been promoted. And I think that he was writing for the whole regiment losses, and it's been misinterpreted that battalion lost 650 to 700. And then Puller being Puller, once he was told later that your battalion wiped out 600 Japanese, of course he's going to say, yeah, my battalion wiped out 600 Japanese. And, they never went down there and counted them. They pulled out. But that's just one of the misconceptions of Guadalcanal, that Puller wiped out 600 men down there, which is not correct. So, and then they pulled back due to the fact that especially now they knew the intelligence was saying there was a massive Japanese convoy coming down, which there was. So they pulled back to the protecting perimeter. But Vandegrift didn't want to give up the Matanikau entirely. So he took a gamble and left 2 battalions at the mouth of Matanikau, so they dug in. So he left 2 battalions there. There was a big gap between the front line of the perimeter of about 3 miles, had a 3-mile gap to the 2 forward deployed battalions. So they were in danger of being cut off themselves, but he took that risk to leave them there because Matanikau was so important. So after the battle.
But of course, he would have had significant artillery available to support them should they get decisively engaged.
Oh, yeah, and we'll see in the next episode how they really beefed that area up, made the mouth Matanikau the most strongest position the Americans had in the campaign. And they were fully supported by artillery. And I'll just say that for the next episode, but how they set the artillery up, it was just massive.
So during this battle, how much combat occurred at night? And how did the TTPs of the Marines and the IJA forces differ?
So Americans didn't attack at night. The first time they ever did it, they were using a bit of out-of-box techniques, and that was in January with the 8th Marines, and we'll get to that. But yeah, they did prefer not to attack at night. Japanese, as we know, loved to attack at night, so that was their most preferred attack time. The plans were very similar, both trying to do holding attacks with envelopments. But the Japanese had just really arrived, the high command had just arrived, the change of command, Murayama and his group had just arrived. And the Japanese plans, I've seen the Japanese plans, they wasn't nearly as complex or detailed as the American plans. I mean, saying complex, the American plans wasn't that complex either. It was pretty straightforward. The operation orders, I've seen those. The Japanese plans had wanted them to advance on the 8th to take the other side of the bank. Now, their plans kept changing because the Japanese high command was totally confused by the Americans' attack. It just showed you how much they were out of touch with what was really going on. They lost their situational awareness. Was the regimental commander, Nakagawa, of the 4th Infantry. No, sorry, it was Nasu. It issued orders on the night of the 8th for a full-scale attack for the 9th. And Nakagawa was like, my guys I've just lost 3 companies, and they've just got wiped out. I've got thousands of Americans just pouring off these ridges straight at us. There's no way I'm going to do this. And then there was delays in the command and the delays in the communications, and it was total chaos on the Japanese. You could just see their whole command and control just was broken down. They didn't know what was going on.
I think that this is a really good point. The Japanese had interior lines of communication, and yet the 1st Battalion, they didn't release their emergency report of the day's action until 1700, and that didn't reach the regimental commander until 0300 the next morning. So there's a whole day's worth of combat that the regimental commanders probably not actually tracking that closely.
Yeah, that was the 1st Battalion of the 4th Regiment. They were the guys that basically wiped out. They were holding the mouth of Matanikau, and they're on the other side too. So they had one company. 3rd Company was the one trapped on the other side. Then the 2nd Company tried to get across the mouth, and it was basically destroyed. And the 1st Company, with what was left of them, held it. I think their battalion commander was kind of reluctant to tell in my opinion, the regimental commander that they basically got defeated and they didn't know what was going on. I mean, he was Lou Face, and I don't know if he wanted to tell him or not, or how the communication broke down, but it definitely broke down because you've seen orders and conflicting orders and orders that didn't make any sense. That you go, why are you issuing this order? You obviously have no awareness of what's really going down here, or the Americans. Thousands of Americans are right in your front door. You should be defending instead of trying to attack. But that was their original orders, to attack. They'd lost all. Yeah, they didn't know what was going on.
So I'm assuming they would have been using runners then to get that message back.
Yes, the Japanese used runners and they used field phones. That was the 2 primary methods they used. Same as the Americans, really. The Americans just relied heavily on the field phones, laying the field phone wires and the electronic field phones. And the Japanese use them quite a bit. In fact, Americans like to use Japanese field phone wire because they're very strong. They'd wrap stuff up. I got a report how they used to make improvised stretcher out of them. They just find Japanese comm wire and just pull it up, cut it, and wrap it around trees and throw a poncho on it and improvise stretchers. They really liked that. But yeah, there was wire everywhere, commo wire or comms, communication wire everywhere. So that was the main ones. They used messengers quite a bit, yes. But they did have radios. They had radios, like HF mainly. They had VHF too in the 17th Army, but as you know, you don't use the VHF on the tactical battlefield. It's more HF.
How successful was each side in integrating their mortars and artillery and close air support if it was available? And was there any naval gunfire support?
In this battle was no naval gunfire support, but the Americans, as you can guess, they did it quite well, even though they're using rudiments or maps were crap, really. I forgot, I'm not an artillery guy, but what they were using was a bit out of the box. We'll call in fire, but they're very effective on the fire, so they used the mortars quite well. The Japanese had high respect for the American artillery and mortars. So American mortars here, they used the 60 millimeters quite a bit, and they used the 81s. Each battalion had 481s. They had 481s millimeters mortars, and yeah, they used them quite a bit. The Japanese, their artillery wasn't really into play here because they hadn't really got their artillery up and running, but they used mortars. As you know, the knee mortar, I'll put brackets knee mortar, which is the top 19 grenade launcher. They had 12 per company, and these things were just saturated areas, so they had those little mortars. They also had 90 millimeter mortars, which is roughly about the equivalent of Americans' 81. They were very, very well respected too by the Americans. They were very accurate at 90 millimeters. They had quite a bit of them. But yeah, the Japanese couldn't compete what the Americans could throw down artillery-wise and fire support-wise. Americans did have CAS, or close air support, but once again, due to the fact that they were operating so close to the enemy lines, you only had a river, 150-yard river, separate them 100 to 150 yards. They didn't really strike the forward Japanese positions. They worked over the rear Japanese positions, as you reinforcements and supply points and what they designated mortar positions. But yeah, they really couldn't hit the front lines. That's really dangerous, too close to American lines to drop their artillery. And then they had Wildcats, P-39s or P-400s, and SPD dive bombers. So strafing and bombing that stage.
Do you know where the mortars were employed from? Because they wouldn't have needed to cross the Matanikau, really.
No. They were in like a few hundred, depends on, obviously 81s were generally about 300 to 400 yards back, maybe 500 yards back. The 60s were generally less than 100 yards back. The thing they did have, though, have some issues. If they were in thick jungle, and they had issues around Matanikau, as you know, they couldn't get the 81s out of there because you need some clearance to get the rounds out. And some of them was pretty thick jungle, so they had to move in some open areas. A lot of that was coconut on the coast. It was coconut plantations. And you had those coral ridges, and they'd just get into the reverse slope or the rear slope of a coral ridge, and that's where they'd set their 81s or mortars up. They could fire over the ridge. I know Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Page, who we'll discuss later, he earned a Medal of Honor, not in this battle, but later on. He was attached to 2-5, and he was in 2.7 at the time as they're moving through, but using heavy guns with the heavy machine guns. In those days, the heavy machine guns were the water-cooled 30 cal, Browning water cals, 1917 models. And they also had the M250 cals, but they were so heavy that he'd set up on the east bank, on the hill 49, and he could cover that whole area. And he was shooting indirect fire with the machine guns. As you know, you can do indirect fire with the machine guns. And he was working his magic up there with these 4 heavy machine guns, just watching the Japanese running back and forth. One was shot, they were shooting like 2,000 yards away at one stage. Yeah, so they had a lot of supporting fire.
So the Battle of Third Matanikau was a significant defeat for the Japanese. How did that upset their planning for the attack on Henderson Field?
Yes, in my opinion, this battle is the most important battle in Guadalcanal, land battle most important in the Guadalcanal campaign. The main reason we'll see for the next episode, the Battle of Henderson Field, how it impacts that with the biggest Japanese assault of the campaign and how it impacted it. So basically, at this stage, it's denied the Japanese the artillery firing platforms. It's denied them the jumping off platform. So it's basically through a major wrench or spanner in the gears of the Japanese. It's derailed their whole operational plan. So now they've got to go back to the whiteboard and they say, well, we can't push down the Matanikau or push down the coastal road with this whole division. What are we going to do now? And another thing, too, our artillery can barely reach Henderson Field now. And some may not even reach Henderson Field, because what they were going to do was they're also going to bring the 75 millimeters and the 70 millimeters up, too, in addition to the 150s and the 100 millimeters. And now that's out of the range of a lot of all their 75 millimeters. So now they got to try to fire from around Cucambana. And so what went from 5 miles is now pushed them to 10 miles, which is and we'll see in the next episode, which is at the very maximum range for the 150s. I'll say this now, I've got an account by a battery commander from the 150s, and he said he only fired about 70, 80 rounds out of one gun because they're fired at max range. And they had to use the max amount of powder, which damaged the breeches because they're putting so much pressure on them. And then he says, after about 70, 80 rounds, my gun was no good anymore. Just became a 1,000, or what, I don't know how much one weighs, but thousands of pound paperweight, so to speak. That's it. But that impacted. And now they couldn't suppress the airfield like they wanted to. So if you can't suppress the airfield, then you can't bring in the fastest convoys. Now the only thing you've got to rely on, or you can start firing some rounds, and we'll see, but it's not really going to suppress it like you wanted. Those 10 days of artillery suppression. Now we have to rely heavily on the battleship bombardment and the airstrikes. And 17th Army planners have to go back to the drawing board and go, well, we can't attack across Matanikau. What are we going to do now? So they had to say, this has really, really derailed their whole plans. And then we'll see in the next episode how it really impacted the plan they did come up with. So we won't talk about that now. We can talk about next episode.
So this is from an operational level. Guadalcanal is becoming increasingly important, so important, in fact, that Lieutenant General Hayakatake, the commander of the 17th Army, actually comes out to Guadalcanal, and he lands on the 9th to take command of operations. He comes ashore on the 9th to learn that the 4th Regiment has been totally annihilated. How big was his headquarters when he landed?
Well, yeah, the thing about him, he was told to, when he landed at night, when he had the staff officer from the 2nd Division basically panicking. He said people were running around and wounded, and he's going, mass chaos. He came to it. Yeah, one of the guys said, "Oh, they're totally destroyed." Which they wasn't totally destroyed, but they'd lost basically a regiment, or sorry, a battalion. Battalion was just totally destroyed. So yeah, they were in a bad way. And right off the bat, one of his main attacking units was down and out. He was off the cards. So they landed, and he formed his headquarters at a place called Cucambana, which is an important trail. I think we talked about last episode or one before. It was on the coastal road, important trail junction. And there's a lot of steep bridges around there with nice covered jungle ravines. So he went up one of those ravines and established his command post. So built like little huts and bivouacs, they called them, along a stream with a nice jungle covering. And dug in. Also, they had air raid shelters and trenches and stuff around. But that was his command post. And he was running the campaign, popular campaign, at the same time from that little jungle ravine, which is, I find amazing.
I think that this is a really important fact that the New Guinea campaign was being run from Guadalcanal because it's effectively got a tactical headquarters with very limited resources. So it shows the importance between the two campaigns. And also, I think this would make it very difficult to be able to make informed decisions and effect command and control over all of New Guinea when you're in a tactical headquarters in a ravine in Guadalcanal.
Yeah, it's just amazing. And initially, his staff in Raval was only 11 guys. And then they said, well, we're going to send you to Guadalcanal because this is the most important effort we got going here. And we go take this whole reinforced division. You're going to take personal command on the ground, and you're going to wipe these Americans off Guadalcanal so we can concentrate back on Port Moresby and send all the forces that we've sent into Guadalcanal now into Moresby and finish the job. So he landed. He had 11 guys, so they beefed him up with a comms unit of about 40 men, and then they threw additional guys to him. So he had about 25 in his staff, including 2 lieutenant colonels they sent directly from the Imperial to what they call important planners from the Imperial General Headquarters from Tokyo. They said, bang, you can have these 2 guys, and they're going to be like your liaison. I still think they're a bit spies for the general command, but yeah, they were in there with him too. So his command, count the SIGs or the communication guys, roughly about 40, another 20, about 60 or 70 men in the Army headquarters or Corps headquarters. You want to equate it to a Western force.
That's very skinny. I'm all for small headquarters, but this is effectively a Corps headquarters. It's 17th Army, but it's a Corps headquarters, and 11 officers to actually effect control with some supporting comms. That is very, very skinny, and doing it in extremely austere conditions.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it wasn't nice conditions. At the same time, he's getting blasted every day. And you'll see as the campaign goes on, he reverts to a hole in January when the 8th General Army staff officers come to visit him. This colonel described meeting high Kentucky. He was in a cave underneath a tree in a stream bank. That was where his headquarters was, the escaped American artillery and air bombardment. And it was still starting to, they really didn't hit Cucamonga that much in October, but the airstrikes were hitting it quite a bit when they could. He could still function in there in October and even November. Well, we'll see when we get to November how that changed. But yeah, it's just unreal when you start reading about it. You go, wow, he's running two major campaigns from a jungle ravine in Cucamonga. It doesn't have a road. He has a trail. That's how he gets to is a trail to his headquarters, a foot trail. It's just, it's surreal.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. You've done a really good job of covering this. I agree. I think this is a really important battle because we are starting to see the declining ability of the IJIA to influence operations against the Marines.
Yeah, and once again, you're starting to see the American air power come to dominance and how it's starting to really dominate this campaign. The Japanese have to suppress or destroy that air power to win. It's all about that air power. And once again, I think we discussed in the first episode how we see everything revolving around the air power, supporting the air power. I think historian, don't quote me, I think it's Ian Toll, which I like Ian Toll's books, but I think Ian Toll actually said that in the Pacific, you will see the ground and the naval supporting the air. While in Europe, you'll see the vice versa. You see the air and the sea supporting the ground. And that's very true. Everything supports kind of the air in the Pacific campaign, Pacific War. Everything's about air power. It's taking the islands, just putting an airfield there to stepping stone to Tokyo. Everything's about the air power. You can't control the sea zone unless you have air power. Everything revolves around air.
Exactly. The air power enables you to affect denial of the sea lines of communication. And if you can do that, then you can't affect logistics. So it's very difficult to conduct joint operations.
Yeah, and the Japanese are starting to see now in October how important that is. They can have, in fact, the Japanese, as you know, even to the end of the campaign, still had naval supremacy. If you think about it, all the way to the end, they had naval supremacy, naval dominance. The Japanese did. They won most battles and they dominated. That's why the U.S. Navy really wasn't here. They kept getting beat, and they didn't have enough power to dominate the Japanese. So the only force multiplier, really, the Americans had was that air. And that unsinkable aircraft carrier. They could control the seas. They could dominate the Japanese during the day. And that's why the Japanese did everything at night. So it's the whole thing about this fast convoy coming in. They can't get the fast convoy in to drop off the thousands and thousands of tons of supplies, the thousands of troops, the real heavy guns, some of the tanks. They can't drop it all off. And they can't keep this whole division of 20,000 now adequately supplied by just running fast destroyers at night. The thing of fast destroyers, even if they run, I've got it all written down, if they run 50 destroyers, they can bring enough food in for 2 days. You need those long transports to offload all this massive tons. Same as Americans. Imagine if Americans had to run everything in fast destroyers. It's just be hard. You couldn't keep a division of 20,000 men supplied. No way. And go on the offensive.
Well, I think this is a really good point about the operational logistics. The Japanese have enough men, they have enough food, they have enough guns, they have enough ammunition. It's just they can't get them to the battlefield.
Exactly. I mean, once again, the Japanese weren't great at logistics, but you read reports that the Japanese Navy had the logistics ready to go in Rabaul. They had supplies. They had everything there to keep the men supplied, but they just couldn't get it there. They could get it there at night, but not enough to keep the guys adequately supplied. That supply line couldn't be maintained because the Cactus Air Force dominated. And it always goes back to the Air Force. If the Americans didn't have that Cactus Air Force, they'd been in a hurt locker. Once again, we know the artillery dominated the land battlefield, but that nothing was without that air. Yeah, just keeping, and it kept the American lines open too during the day. Americans would bring supplies in during the day, and that's when American convoys would come in during the day, because once it kept the Japanese ships away, and also kept the Japanese Val dive bombers and some of the Betty bombers away too, because you had close air support or cap to intercept the bombers and intercept any dive bombers coming after the shipping. The Japanese tried, but every time they get blasted out of the air, operate 6 miles away from their airfields, they get blasted out of the air. So that's how the Americans did it. They brought in all their supplies during the day once the convoys really started going, and troops.
Enabled by the early warning, which was a combination of crypto-analysis, the coast watchers, and radar. Yeah,
which is, they all worked hand in hand. And I think people forget that too, about obviously the coast watchers did a great job, but it wasn't all about the coast watchers. And it wasn't all about the radio intercepts. It was a combination of different intelligence gathering. It came up with that. And plus, too, most of the time the Japanese tacked every day at 11 or 12 o'clock, Tojo time they call it, because it took that long when daylight came to fly that 600 miles from Rabaul. It wasn't until later in the campaign when they said, we really need to suppress this American air power. They started trying to build advanced bases in Upper Solomons, especially around like Munda, New Georgia, in that area. It was quite interesting when they started building it there. But yeah, and we'll discuss that later. Some of that generally comes in November. Some of the countermeasures they tried to do to suppress American air power.
Yes, because that would have enabled them to bring in their short-range Zeros and to try and wrest control of the air over Henderson Field from the Cactus Air Force. But they were slow in doing that.
Yeah, no, it was slow in reacting a lot of times. Once again, we discussed in the first episode, they didn't really have the resources, IGA-wise, to do a fast ground response. They scraped together what they could, but after Edson's Ridge, you had units getting the notifications from all over the Pacific to start heading to Guadalcanal. But once again, just like the Americans, Japanese had shipping issues, transports, just getting them in there and getting enough transports to transport people to the zones.
Excellent. Well, a thorough retelling of not only the actions, but also the lessons that come out of Third Matanikau. And we will return next week with the Battle of Henderson Field.
Yeah, which is the apex, should be a good episode.
Once again, Dave has done an amazing job of telling us the story of what happened during the Battle of Third Matanikau. Reflecting on the battle, reflecting on the lessons learned, I think there's a few things that really stand out in Third Matanikau. Firstly, the reinforcement of the importance of that land to the east of the mouth of the Matanikau. If the Japanese can put their artillery there, they will be able to range Henderson Field, and that means they'll be able to deny Cactus Air Force the ability to conduct air operations. That means that the Imperial Japanese Navy will be able to resupply the troops on the ground. Already, we're starting to see the effect of malnutrition and disease that is caused by the lack of supplies to the troops on Guadalcanal for the Japanese. The Cactus Air Force, in conjunction with the US Navy, is able to exert sea control in the environs of Guadalcanal during the day. The Imperial Japanese Navy just has nighttime to be able to operate, and that doesn't give them a lot of time to offload supplies. They need to use fast destroyers rather than transport ships so that they can get in, unload very quickly, and then escape before being in range of aircraft at daybreak. Secondly, the Japanese really have struggled to synchronize effects between the units that were defending to the west of the Matanikau and the troops that were supporting them. And I'm thinking predominantly around the artillery. We hear very little about any counter-battery efforts. We hear very little about defensive fires to protect the troops. I think what we're seeing here is a combination of effects. Lack of ammunition, lack of situational awareness, lack of communications. And that means that the troops just aren't getting the support that they need to be able to hold their ground and inflict casualties on the Marines. These issues aren't new, but they are being definitely reinforced at the Third Battle of the Matanikau, and they will plague the IGA for the rest of the campaign. Lastly, we see Hayakatake coming to Guadalcanal. He is the commander of the 17th Army, and he is moving to what is becoming the pivotal battle within his AO. Remember, though, that he is also currently commanding the withdrawal for the Kokoda campaign. So in October, we've got the withdrawal going through Templeton's Crossing and Eora Village. Hayakatake has got a lot going on. He is trying to manage two significant battles from a very austere headquarters under very austere conditions. And I can't imagine that that would be helping him at all. So we'll leave it there. We'll be back next week looking at the big battle of Henderson Field. If you got something out of this, please like or share anything that you see on social media. And if you want to support the podcast, we've now got a Patreon account to help us support and continue producing all of the professional military education that I produce. That's it. We'll be back next week with the Battle of Henderson Field.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.